Hey, what up? Welcome back to another quick Flutter tutorial. In this one, I'm going to show you how to code up a functional expense tracker with a minimal aesthetic design. So you can add a new expense, which you can also edit and delete, and we will display the monthly totals in a nice bar graph. Now this light mode looks pretty sick, but let's also add a dark mode as well. By the way, if you're new to the world of coding apps, I have condensed my 5 years of experience into a 10-hour course. This Flutter masterclass will help you get up to speed to code your own apps, and alongside the course you will also get the full source code to all of my Flutter apps, so check that out below. Now just before we start coding, let's have a look at a nice visual diagram just to know what we're about to code up. So from our phone, we're going to be able to do 3 things, which is firstly create a new expense, and we can edit and delete it as well. So we're going to organize this in an expense database. And so in here we can store each individual expense. So like, let's say we have 3 expenses as an example, and each expense has a name as well as an amount. So then we can gather all of this data together and organize it into a nice bar graph, and then we'll give it back to our app. Sweet. So I've opened up a brand new Flutter project, and just to keep everyone on the same page, in my main function I'm running my app, which brings us to this home page, which I've got in a nice folder called pages just to keep our code nice and organized. And so the first thing we need to do is we're going to use the ISAR database for some local storage so that we can save our information. So I've made a separate tutorial on how to use ISAR, but I can show you real quick how to do it here. So I'm just looking at the ISAR database, and we're just going to need to copy this code here just to import the packages. So if you open up your terminal, I'm just going to paste this in. And so this should have added, say 3, I think, packages. So if you go to your pubspec.yaml, you can see we added these 3 packages. Alright, cool. Now the first thing we're going to do is to create a new folder called models, and we're just going to create a model for an expense. So each expense, let's give it an ID, which we can just auto increment. So this will be 0, 1, 2 every time we create a new expense. And we just want to know the name and the amount. And let's also include a date time as well. So once you have a class like this, we have to add a collection tab, and we have to add this line here. So part expense.g.dart. So it's the exact same file name as this one, but we just need this line to generate the ISAR file. So what that means is in our terminal, we just need to run this little command. And what it does is it's just going to create this generated file. And so if you click into this, it says do not modify by hand. So we don't need to touch this at all. But this is just so that we can create a custom object like an expense and save it to our database. But now what we can do is we can go to our library and create a new folder called database. And let's create our expense database. So firstly, let's get our ISAR object. And I'm just going to have a list of expenses. Let's call it all expenses. And so we're just going to fill out this class here. And I like to have a bit of a plan. So the first thing is I need to set up. We're going to create some getter methods. We have some operations to fill out. And also maybe some helper methods at the end. So the very first thing, just in terms of the setup, I need to initialize the database. So we're going to create a method here, just called initialize. And firstly, we need to get the directory. And then we can say isar.open, and you can see we can say expense schema and just give it the directory path. So this is just for storing our data in our local device. And then let's create a getter method, which just means anywhere else in the code. If we want to get this all expense list, then we can just return that. Cool, so that's all the setting up we really need. Now when it comes to the operations, this is the main part of the expense database. So operations, what I really mean is like the CRUD operations. So create, read, update, and delete. So more specifically, we're going to create a new expense. we're going to read the expenses from the database. And then we can update, meaning like edit an expense, and also delete an expense. So let's just start off with creating a new expense. All we need as a parameter is we just need to know what the new expense is, so let's accept that. And then to add it to our ISAR database, we just need to say await ISAR.write transaction and go to your ISAR expenses and just put in your new expense. And so once we've done that, we just want to reread from our database so that we can display it correctly. And so we're just going to create our read method now. And so for this one, what we really mean by read is we just want to fetch all of the existing expenses from our database. And then we can give it to our local expense list and then display it in our UI. So let's create a list here called fetched expenses. And to retrieve all of our expenses in our database, we can just say ISAR expenses and find all. Cool, and then let's just clear our current list and just add it all in. And then to update the UI, let's say notify listeners. Sweet, so in our create new expense method, I'm just going to read the expense at the end. So after we've made any change, I'm always going to reread the expenses. So let's move on to the updating. So if I want to update a particular expense, I just want to know what the ID of that expense is that we're updating, and also what is this updated expense. So firstly, we just want to make sure that the new expense has the same ID as the existing one, and then we're going to update it in the database and just reread. And lastly, we just want to delete, which is pretty easy. All we need to know is what's the ID, and then we can just delete it. And let's reread. Awesome, so that's most of the expense database pretty much done. So let's actually set this up in our app. So if you come back to our main.dart file, let's say widgets, Flutter, binding, initialize, and then let's initialize our database. So this one will open up the ISAR database on startup, and I need some simple state management. So I'm just going to import another package. So let's say Flutter pub add provider, which is a very popular state management tool. So when we run our app, let's use a change notifier provider, and then we can give it our expense database and then run the app. Cool. So what we're doing here is, if you look at our methods of the operations, this notify listeners is for updating the UI anytime any change has been made. So that's why provider is pretty helpful. So now let's start filling out the UI for this app. So firstly, I need a floating action button. And let's put a add icon. So when I click on this, what I want to do is I want to open a new expense box. So anything UI related, let's create here. So let's see what this looks like. If I click on this floating action button, nothing's happening because we should give it the method. And so if I click on this now, you can see it's going to open up this little box. And so what I want to do in this box is to accept a new expense, which means we're going to need some text fields. So I'm just going to come to the top here and create a text controller. We need one for the name and also the amount. So in our alert dialog box, let's create a column, and the first one is going to be the user input for the expense name, and then below that let's have another one for the expense amount. Cool, so if I just save this and I run it, you can see there's our text field, so you can start typing stuff in there. Now one little neat trick you can do is this main axis size, we can just say minimum, and then it'll just wrap around just the essential children. Also now in these text fields, by the way, we can actually put a nice decoration because I want to put a hint text. And so what a hint text does is, you can see if I just save this, it will kind of give you a hint for the user, like what you should type in here, right? So like the name and the amount. Sweet, and then below that we need some actions because we need a couple buttons. We need a cancel button and we need a save button. Now, just to keep our code nice and clean, I'm going to create these widgets below. So I'm going to say cancel button. And so if I'm going to cancel this button, then what I'm going to do is we're just going to pop the box. And we should also clear the controllers just to make sure that we get rid of everything the user typed in. So if I just try this out, you can see I can type stuff in and I can cancel and then it'll pop the box. So that's a very easy one, the cancel button. Let's create one for the save button. So this will be a very similar situation, except on the on pressed, we firstly only want to save if there's something in the text field to save, because otherwise we're going to save blank expenses. So we're just going to do a quick check here and say if, and just make sure each controller is not empty. And so only when you have both of those text fields filled, then we can start doing our business. So we're going to pop the box, create our new expense, save it to the database and clear the controllers. Okay, so let's start by popping the box, and then we can create a new expense. Cool, and if you look at the amount, it's got a red squiggle because the amount is meant to be a double value, like it's meant to be a number, where currently it's just like a string, like a text. So this is why I'm going to create a new folder called just helper, and in this helper functions file, I just like to have this for some helpful functions used across the app. So for example, currently I just want something to just convert a string to a double nicely. So we're just going to say double and then pass the string. And then if it's nothing, then give it 0. So then what I can do is come back to my home page and then I can say convert string to double and use that method nicely. So once we've created a new expense, let's save it to the database. So we're going to go context.read the expense database. And then you can see here all of the different options, which is the create new expense that we had before. Sweet, and then we want to just clear the controllers again. Cool, so let's give our button. And let's see how this works. So I can now say food and I can type in like a number and then I can save it. So looks like I can save information and new expenses, but I can't see it in our app. So let's try to read it. So on the initial state, when the app first gets launched, let's say provider and go to our expense database and we just want to read expenses. And we should say listen.false. So once we read the expenses, if we come back down to our UI in the body, let's create a list view in the body. Let's come back down to our UI and this scaffold, let's wrap it in a consumer widget so that we can consume the data in our expense database. So what we can do here now is in the body, we can create a list view. We can go to the value and go to all of the expenses. And so for the item count, we just want to know the length. And the item builder, we're going to create a list tile. So firstly, let's just do a bit of code here and extract the individual expense from all of the expenses by going through the index. And then let's return the list tile UI. We can give it the individual expenses name and the individual expenses amount. Okay, that should be good. So I'm just going to save this, and you can see that we can start to see our expenses on the screen. Cool. And one thing that I can see right away is the number is a good number, but I want it in like a decimal sort of dollar money amount. Okay, so let's come back to our helper function, right? And I'm going to create a new helper function here for formatting double amounts into dollars and cents. So let's say format amount, and I'm just going to accept a double. And what we're going to do here is, there's actually a really nice package for this one as well. So Flutter pub add and type intl. And so we can import this package. And this is good because we can say number format, and we just want the currency. And the symbol, we want the dollar sign, and let's have 2 decimal digits. Cool, so if I come back to my homepage and my list tile, let's give it that format amount, and you can see it's formatted nicely into the currency. Sweet, now I want to decorate this list tile a bit further. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new folder called components, and this is where I like to have the custom widgets. So I'm just going to have my first custom widget, which is my list tile, and the bit of information that varies between the list tile is the title and then the trailing. And so before I decorate this further, just save it and come back to the home page, and then we can just get rid of this and just start typing my list tile. Cool, so that cleans up our code, and then now we can just customize it in this separate file. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I need to have a way to edit and delete this expense. My favorite way of doing this is to use a slidable widget. So open up your terminal, and then we can say Flutter pub add Flutter slidable, which again I've also made a separate tutorial for, so check that out. But I can show you real quick right now how to do it. So you can wrap your list tile in a slidable widget, and I want to go to the end action pane, which means sliding from the end of the list, so on the right side. And so we can create an action pane, give it a motion, and I just want 2 children here, so one for the settings option and one for the delete option. So we want to have a slidable action, and let's also require these methods at the top when we create this list tile. So the first one is the edit pressed, so it's going to have a settings icon. And the second one is the delete pressed, so let's have a delete icon. So what did we just do? If you come back to our home page, you should see a red squiggle because we have to fill out the on edit pressed and on delete pressed. So we haven't created these methods, so let's just do that real quick at the top. So when we want to edit an expense, we want to open an edit box, kind of similar to before. So I'm just going to grab that bit of code and just switch it up a little bit. Now when we edit, the one thing I want to do is I want to pre-fill the existing values in the text field, right? We want to know what the existing information was. So let's just do that by accepting the expense that we're about to edit, and just get the existing name and the existing amount, and let's just put that in the hint text. And we need a cancel button, and then for the save button, we're going to need a new button here called edit expense button. So for this one, we're going to need to know a parameter for the expense, and let's return a material button. And for the on pressed, we're going to save as long as at least one text field has been changed. So when it comes to editing, you don't have to change all of the fields, but as long as one of them is different and the user updated just one of them at least, then we can start to do our business. So we can pop the box, we can create a new updated expense and save it to the database and so on. So just starting with popping the box, and then we can create a updated expense. And so we're just going to do a quick check here, right? So the name controller, if it's not empty, then give it whatever's in that name controller. Otherwise, if it is empty, then just return the original expense name. Same thing for the amount. So we're only going to update it if there is something to update. Otherwise, we're going to give it the existing amount. And the date time should just be the current date right now. Cool. And the only thing we want to keep the same is the ID of the expense. Cool. And then we can update this expense. Sweet. So let's give the correct parameters here. And let's finally do the deleting box. So for the deleting, we don't need any text fields. We just need an option to delete it. So let's create that down below. We just want to pop the box and then just delete the expense. But everything should be working now. So if I just save this, right, you can slide to the left on a particular expense and you can see the new icons showing up. So I can edit, and it looks like it's editing correctly. And you can also delete, which for some reason I can't see the delete text because I forgot to give it. Let's give it a text widget saying delete. Cool, and then if you save this, yay, we can delete an expense. So functionality works. Let's just come back to our list tile real quick and then just decorate this up because I want the settings option to have some color. So I'm just going to decorate this up. The border radius, let's make it a bit curved as well. And for the delete button, let's make it red. Awesome, now that we got the functionality down, let's have a way to display this data in a nice bar graph. So I'm going to create a new folder here called bar graph, and let's start by creating an individual bar. Each individual bar, I'm just going to need to know the X integer, so like the position on the X axis, and also the amount on the Y axis for how much expenses we have for that month. And then let's create another file called bar graph. And for this one, I'm going to open my terminal and add another package called flcharts or flchart, which is the most famous Flutter graph package that there is. And so once you've done that, we can now create a stateful widget called my bar graph. And let's just accept a list of doubles called monthly summary. And also, I just want to know the start month. So I just want to know so for example, the monthly summary would be something like $25, $500, $120 for each month. And the reason why the start month is an integer is because like 0 would represent January, 1 would represent February, and so on. So this list, firstly, will hold the data for each bar. And then we want to initialize the bar data. So we're going to use our monthly summary to create a list of bars. So we're going to say list.generate, and depending on the length of our monthly summary, we can create our individual bar. Then we can come back down to our build method and let's say bar chart, and you can see there it is from our package. And we have to fill out this bar chart data. So firstly, just to see this working right, the minimum, let's say 0, maximum, let's say 100. And let's come to our homepage UI. And you can see currently we're just displaying a big list of expenses. I'm going to grab all this and put it in a column. And let's expand the list just to fill up all the space. And at the top, we're going to have a bar graph. And so we need to give it the monthly summary. And let's come back to our expense database and create a helper method here to calculate firstly the total expenses for each month. And let's also have a way to just get the start month and get the start year very easily. Starting with the calculating the total expenses for each month. We're going to ensure that the expenses are read from the database so that it's updated. And then we're going to create a map to keep track of the total expenses for each month. And let's iterate over all the expenses. Let's just start by reading the expenses. And then we're going to create this map of monthly totals. If you don't know what a map is, you can see here I've got it as an integer for every double. So 0 would represent January. And let's say there's $250 in January. We can create a map like this. So we're going to use a quick for loop to go through each expense in all of our expenses. And let's extract the month from the date of the expense first. And if the month is not in the map yet, then initialize it to 0. And then we can add the expense to the total for the month. Cool, and then let's just return the monthly totals. And then let's just have a couple quick methods here just to get the start month and the start year. Awesome. So currently in our consumer, we're just going straight to the scaffold, but let's grab all the scaffold and I'm just going to do some bit of code just before I return the scaffold UI. I want to firstly get the dates, and then I want to calculate the number of months since the first month. And then we're just going to display only the expenses for the current month. So let's use those couple of methods that we just created to get the start month and the start year. And the current month is going to be just the date, time, now as month, and same for the year. Now we need to calculate the number of months since the first month, right, to know how many bars we're going to display. So I'm just going to come back to my helper function and let's create this method real quick just to calculate the number of months it's been since the first month. So I'm just going to need to know as an input the start year, start month, current year, current month. Sweet, so come back to the home page and we can just say integer month count and give it that method. Awesome, so if you look at the bar graph here, I'm going to wrap this in a future builder. And the feature we're going to listen for is the data for the bar graph. Let's just create that feature at the top real quick. And I'm just going to have a method here just to refresh the graph data, just to make sure that we got the updated version. If you go to your provider in the expense database, you can see that we can access that method we created, the calculate monthly totals. And so when we initialize this app, let's read the database on the initial startup, and then they're going to load the futures to refresh the graph data. So what did we just do? If you come back down to our graph UI, we can give it our future. And then in the builder, we firstly will just check if it's loaded. So if the connection state is done loading, then we can get the monthly total data. And we can create our list finally. And then return our bar graph. Otherwise, if it's still loading, let's just return a text widget saying loading. Okay, cool. Hopefully this works. Now, there's a bit of an issue because we should give it a size. So let's wrap this graph UI in a sized box, let's say about 250. And yay, you can see there's our graph. Now it's being covered by the notch area at the top, so you can actually wrap this in a safe area widget to just avoid that notch area. And now we have our bar graph. Sweet, so now that our bar graph is displayed on the screen, let's come back to our bar graph.dart file and start filling this out. So right now we've only got just minimum 0, max is 100. And so you can see even with this max, you can give it say 200, and on the screen it will switch up the maximum. So for now, I'm just going to fix it to be 100. And let's start filling out this grid data. So let's decorate this up to our minimal style. The FL grid data, I'm going to say show false, so you can see the grid goes away. And then I want to fix up the border. So no borders. And then the title. So this is the text, kind of the numbers you see on the sides of the graph. So what I'm going to do is we're going to say, firstly, show to be true. But I'm only going to show it for the bottom tile. So the top tile, I'm going to say false, and same as the left and the right tiles. I'm not going to show them, and I'm only going to show the bottom tile. So let's say show title to be true for this one, and then we're going to get the titles widget. So just to keep our code nice and clean, I'm just going to create this at the bottom. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to use a switch statement. And so we're going to look at this value as an integer, and then remember 0 is for January, and then 1 for February, 2 for March, and so on. And by the way, I actually want to create this on the outside. Let's just copy this and just put it on the very outside of the braces. Finally, we can just return the side title widget. And so hopefully we will be able to see the bottom titles like January, February, March. So currently we don't actually have any data to represent it. So if you go to the bar groups, we can go to our bar data. And just put this as a map. And so for the X, we're going to give it the data X. And for the bar rod, this is going to be for the data Y. Cool. And then at the end, let's just convert this to a list. Okay, cool. So it looks like we have expenses, but we can't see the graph right now. So that's because we didn't actually even initialize it. So when we create this build method, let's just initialize it. And if I save this, you can see there's our first graph for January. And if I create a new expense, it'll go up. And it looks like it does go up, but it doesn't update immediately. So what we need to do is if we come back to our home page, that's what this refresh graph data method was for. Okay, so every time, let's say we create a new expense and we do all of this stuff, let's also refresh the graph. Which means we should do the same thing for when we edit and delete. Cool, so now if I do anything like create a new expense, the graph updates immediately. Awesome. Now if you look carefully, I feel like this is kind of cut off. So you can select this reserved size and just give it some number, just so that we have some space on the bottom. Okay, cool. And then now we can start decorating up our bars. So on the bar chart rod data, first of all, I want to control the border, like the corners. And then we can give it a color. So I'm just going to go for my minimal style. By the way, the simulator's clock goes according to your clock on your computer. So what you can do is actually go to your settings, whether you're on Mac or PC, just go to your settings and find your date option, and you can actually set the date manually. And so you can go forward in time. And so what I want to check is I want to go forward 1 month, so into February, and you can see my graph will update accordingly. And so if I create a new expense, obviously I'm in February now, so now that bar is going to go up, which means we can use this for some testing just to make sure it works for all of the other months and stuff like that. Now, one thing I can see is there's a bit of a gap. The gap's too big for my liking between the 2 months. So let's have some bar dimension sizes. So for example, like bar width, let's say 20, and then the space between the bars, let's say 15. And also just to see what this looks like, if I go to December, let's see what a whole year would look like, right? And then if I go past December, like into the next few months, you can see we have a little error we need to fix. Like we're clearly into January, February, March, and it's got the space for it, but it doesn't actually show us. And the reason is, if you go to our getting the bottom tiles, remember this integer for the value? We're only looking at the cases between 0 and 11. We didn't consider the cases for like 12, 13, 14, 15, like past a year. So what we can do here is going to use this percent sign. So this one is for the remainder. So I'm going to basically get the remainder when you divide it by 12. So this should make sure that it goes on for the future years. So if I save this, you can see, I can see the January, February, March. Okay, so that's cool. And the thing is though, I want this to be sort of scrollable. Like I don't want to show every single month. Otherwise the bars are going to get so small. So in the sized box, let's control this width. And I'm going to show the width just depending on however long the bar data is. And then I'm going to wrap this in a single child scroll view, which basically just lets it become scrollable. And I want this to be scrollable horizontally. And so basically what we did is we just fixed the size of this and then instead made it scrollable. So we're only showing maybe like a maximum of a year Awesome. Now let's come back to our individual bars and decorate this up further. So I actually want a back drawer. So the kind of container to fill it. So like the empty space behind it. I want to make it a lighter gray or maybe a white. And actually this scaffold doesn't have a color. I always like to make it slightly gray instead of completely white at the back. And this is looking pretty good so far. And also one thing to notice is, you know, the max Y, we have it as a fixed number, like 100, 300 or 500. Now, depending on different people's expenses, this number should adjust. Like we shouldn't fix this number. So I'm going to have a way to calculate the upper limit for the graph. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to initially set it at $500, but let's adjust it if the spending is way past this amount. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our monthly summary and we're just going to sort this from smallest to biggest. And then we're going to just get the biggest one and just slightly increase it by, say, 5%. And so if the max is less than 500, then we're just going to keep it at $500. Otherwise, we're going to return this max. And so in the next month, April, for example, let's say I start to reach the similar amount of spending. And then if I go beyond that, then that's going to be my new max. And so it'll kind of put everything else relative to each month. Now for the group space, we can say space between bars. That's just the gap between each of the individual bars. And I'm going to add some padding just on the horizontal. And I think that looks pretty good. Awesome. Now one thing is when I create a new expense, currently it's just adding it to the bottom of the list. Whereas I feel like I should have it on the top, being the latest one. So to do that, let's just go to our build method here again, and we want to only display the expense for the current month as opposed to displaying, you know, every single expense in the entire existence. We just want to display it for just this month. So then in the list view builder, we can just change this to the current month expenses. And cool. And like I said before, we want to reverse this list to show the latest item first. Awesome. Now in our expense database, we want to calculate the current month total, and let's just display it at the top. So we're going to ensure the expenses are read from the database again, just to so that we have the most updated version. Let's get the current month and the year, and let's filter these expenses to include only those for this month in this year. And for that month, we're going to calculate the total. So that is another feature that we're going to load up for the graph. So let's create the calculate current month total. And so instead of saying refresh graph data, I'm just going to say refresh data. And in here, just do both of them. So the graph as well as the month total. Okay, awesome. Now let's come to our scaffold and create an app bar. I'm going to make the background transparent, and I just want to display in the title. For the future, we're going to listen to the current month total, and then when it's loaded, I just want to display that total. Yep, there it is. So if I add a new expense or delete or anything like that, it should update at the top. Awesome. And then next to this, let's also display just what the current month is. So I'm just going to go to my helper function and just get a current month name. And so in our app bar, let's just put this in a row. And so we've got the amount total, and then next to it, let's display the month. Sweet, there it is. Now let's just space between though. And that's looking pretty good. Okay, now one last thing is I want to make sure that we want to display the most current month. So in other words, instead of displaying the first part of this list, like the scrollable graph, I want to go to the very end. So I want to make sure to have a scroll controller to make sure it scrolls to the end. In other words, the latest month. So in the initial state, if I just start this app and then I just scroll to the end, and give our scroll view the scroll controller, if you restart this, it'll just scroll to the end automatically to the current month, which is what we want. And another bug that we have is currently we are in March, like in the next year. And if I create a new expense, it doesn't actually update this current March. It goes and updates last year's March. So that's because we are only taking into consideration January to December for just the first year. So let's take into consideration for years as well. So if you come back to our expense database, you can see in the calculate monthly totals, we are currently accepting in the map an integer to represent the month, right? Between 0 and 11. So like for example, it's like a map 0 being January and then 1, 2, 3, 4 up until 11. And so we need to now take into consideration not just months, but also years. So I'm going to change this from an integer to a string. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have like a year month string. So something like this, 2024 1 or 0, 2024 1, 2024 2, 2024 11, and then in the new year we're going to go 2025 0, and then go on from there. So this will take into consideration the year as well. So let's change this up to string. And so we're going to have like a year month value here. So let's just fix up all of this stuff. And then now let's come back to our refresh data. And you can see here, we're going to switch this up to string. And I'm just going to restart this. We have some fresh data. Let's fix up some of this code when the data is loaded. So we're going to accept that map as a string now. And so we're going to calculate the year month, considering the start month and the index. So we're going to calculate the year and the month. And then create the key in the format of year month, like I showed you before. And then we can return the total for that year month combo, or 0 if it doesn't exist. Awesome. So if I save this, it should work. So it's working for January. Now let's just change the time again. And I'm going to go to January for the next year. And so if I just delete something, if I just update this, you can see we're in January in the next year. And if I create a new expense in this month, then it'll update for the new January as opposed to the old one. So now it's taking into consideration years. Cool. Now just to finish off, let's just decorate up this list tile component. And so what I'm just going to do is just wrap this list tile with a container, and we're going to just add some decoration. So I really like a nice minimal style. I'm going to just use a gray color that's a little bit lighter. Let's create some margin to have some space. I think this could be even more lighter. And of course, you guys know I don't like any sharp corners, so let's curve the border radius. And I feel like if I come back to my home page, we could put in some space between the graph and the list. Yeah, that looks better. So one thing I can see is if you slide to get the options, it's kind of not looking exactly the way I want. So let's just come back to our list tile, and this margin, let's get rid of this. And we're just going to put that exact same padding around the entire widget. Cool. So if you just save this and try again, then yep, that's the look I want to go for. Sweet. Now I'm just going to leave it at that. We have a nice minimal functional expense tracker. If you have any questions, just comment below. You can download the full code with the more updated stuff in my website. So check that out if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.